Hi, I'm Bree Davies, and you're watching Hello Denver, Are You Still There? This show is a conversation about Denver, for Denver, and with Denver. Today's episode is our first episode ever, and I'm really excited to have my friend Rosemary McDonnell-Horita on the show from Atlantis community. We're going to talk a little bit about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which turns 30 this year. It was signed into law in 1990. We're also going to talk about Denver as one of the many epicenters of the disability rights movement. In this conversation, we mentioned several figures, including Wade Blank and our close friend, Rosie and I's close friend, Kaylin Heffernan, who is the first queer disabled woman to run for mayor in Denver last election. So when we mentioned Kaylin, we're talking about Kaylin Heffernan. Please enjoy this conversation with me and Rosie.
What you know about that? Hello. What you know about that? What you know about that? Hello.
Hi. Can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Rosemary. I work at Atlantis community. I use she, her pronouns. I've been working at Atlantis for the last 3 years as a youth coordinator, but I've been doing the work for almost 10 plus years. So over half of my life.
That's amazing. Let's talk a little bit because the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was signed into law in 1990. So the anniversary of it is this year, but the actual signing of the bill was in July. Can you talk a little bit about what the Americans with Disabilities Act is?
Yes. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is a federal law that was passed July 26th, 1990, and it was one of the first protections for people with disabilities to be able to live independently in the community, and that includes employment, going to restaurants, going to concerts that we love to do, and really allowed me as a young adult with a disability who was born post Americans with Disabilities Act to be able to go to school with my brother, to be able to get the jobs that I wanted without being discriminated against. And that was because a lot of folks prior to 1990 did a lot of advocacy work to make sure that those protections were put in place.
You mentioned the ability to live on your own, and I think when we talk about Denver's role in the disability rights movement, we're talking about independent living and the role of Wade Blank and the Gang of 19. So can you talk a little bit about what that movement was prior to the ADA being signed into law, especially in that late 60s, early 70s, sort of after following the civil rights movement into the disability rights movement, what was happening before we got to the Americans with Disabilities Act?
Historically, people with disabilities were institutionalized, and that started with mental wards and then became a institution for people who were deemed not worthy or not normal, and they were shoved into nursing homes and institutions without a lot of choice or a lot of options. And families were basically told by doctors that this was something that needed to happen and there was no other option. And so fast forward to the early 60s and the 70s, and there were still folks living in nursing homes. Most of them were living there from really early childhood until death. And Wade Blank was someone who was kind of a hippie. He was learning under Martin Luther King Jr. During the civil rights era, really studying the nonviolent protests and ways that movements were being pushed and revolutions were being escalated during that time. And he decided to take a break from doing racial work in the South, and he ended up moving to Denver and got a job as a youth coordinator at a nursing home called Heritage House in the early 70s. And when he got there, he was surrounded by all these young folks who were between the ages of 12 and 19 who had lived there for most of their life and ate the same food every day, wore the same thing every day, didn't have any autonomy over their lives whatsoever. And Wade Blank comes in, and not in a white savior way or a paternalistic way, but more just genuinely trying to get to know these folks and their experience. And he asked them for the first time of their life, what do you want? What is it that you want? And a lot of them wanted to go to a Grateful Dead concert at Red Rocks, or they wanted Rolling Stone posters on their walls, or they wanted a pet. And Wade Blank made sure that that happened. And in building relationships with these folks, he learned that this was not something that they had chosen, not something that they wanted. And they wanted to live in the community. They didn't want to die in a nursing home. And so it was in 1975-ish that Wade Blank started to have conversations with partners like Denver Housing Authority to find an apartment complex, to renovate it, to make it accessible, and then slowly started to move people out of nursing homes into their own apartments, which is how Atlantis community started. And so since 1975, we have been doing the work of making sure that people with disabilities are living in the communities of their choice, have the opportunity to advocate for the things that they need to be able to live an equitable life, just like any of their non-disabled peers. And a lot of that movement of having freedom of choice then started to get the ball rolling for other legislation to follow, and eventually became the Rehabilitation Act in 1973. It became the Americans with Disabilities Act, and who knows what it's going to look like in the future.
That's incredible. And I think you're speaking to something that I wouldn't say we take for granted now, but I think we just see every day and assume that it always was this way. And one of those things when we're talking about independent living, like you're talking about, for me, the full understanding as an abled person to know that someone like you, my friend, just because you use a wheelchair would mean you were confined to a life of living in a nursing home. And I know we've talked about this before, that would be the equivalent to sort of living in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And not having the autonomy to make any of these decisions. On the Denver side of the scale, I think what also we should talk about that comes out of Wade's work, as well as the work that you're saying he did within the community, is what the Gang of 19 did around transportation. Because prior to this movement, people with disabilities would be tax-paying citizens and not be able to utilize things their taxes were paying for, like public transportation. So talk a little bit about the Gang of 19 and that movement and moment around public transportation.
I think Denver is very unique in that public transportation is not a bucket of money that the city pays for. It's paid by taxes. And so once Wade Blank started helping move these folks out into the community of their choice, they wanted to go to the grocery store, they wanted to go to the movies or hang out and visit their other friends. And they weren't able to do that because none of the buses were accessible. And leading up to the actual protest, Wade Blank and his team had conversations with RTD, basically laying out and saying, we know that you can do this. You have the money to do this. These folks are paying into a system that they can't access right now because it's not accessible. And you just bought 120 new buses that could be retrofit, and you're just not doing it. And RTD's excuse or reason was that they couldn't afford to do it, or that there weren't enough disabled people to be able to give a good enough reason to make all of these buses have lifts. And so as a result, this group of 19 people decided that they had had enough and RTD wasn't listening to their asks. So they had to strategize and do something that would get their attention. And because Wade Blank was trained in nonviolent protests and nonviolent action, he helped organize these 19 folks who ended up on the corner of Colfax and Broadway, one of the busiest intersections in Denver. And they chained their wheelchairs together. They laid their bodies in front of RTD buses, blocking traffic for 2 days in 1978. And that was the first time that we had really seen a big action like this in Denver around people with disabilities. Like, at that time, they weren't expecting people with disabilities to even be out of their homes, let alone doing something so revolutionary like protesting in a nonviolent way. And the police were so distraught and didn't even know what to do that they ended up arresting these folks, the folks in wheelchairs. They ended up arresting their attendants because they were able-bodied and they knew how to arrest them, but they had no idea how to arrest disabled people without the press and the optics looking bad. So it was really a pivotal moment for the movement to then start using this action and using their bodies in this way. And when you are disabled, your body is a statement in itself, but then taking it one step further and using it as a statement for political action, I think is really powerful.
And I think that speaks to something that's really interesting and layered about this movement, where you talk about the folks doing the action. You know, there's a whole community around you that's creating this action over days and days. But the people that were actually arrested were the attendants, the folks that care for the people with disabilities. And you're saying because they didn't know how to arrest somebody who uses a wheelchair. So it was kind of, the optics thing is an interesting thing too, because it's like, okay, we're going to arrest people with disabilities, but we're not really going to arrest them because we can't. So then we're actually treating them as second-class citizens in this moment where they are doing the illegal thing. And I heard this really fascinating interview with a gentleman from the movement, and I wish that I could remember his name, but he talked about once they actually started getting arrested, they didn't stop. Like, the movement, you know, ADAPT, which is one of the groups that grew out of this, or the main group that grew out of this movement, was all over the country doing direct action and getting arrested. And so I just think that it's a very powerful movement in the visual sense that we see that disparity that you're talking about. And that's something, so these movements leading up to the ADA, or these actions and all of these things, bring things like independent living, the ability to access education, the ability to get a job or get to your job. But the ADA also addresses, or I think maybe this is what we've talked about as the future of the ADA, is addressing the other things that are kept from people with disabilities. So when we talk about, you and I go to a restaurant, okay, they have a ramp. It's like kind of shaky. You get in. What else it needs to be addressed in that restaurant to make it fully accessible? Like, I know that we've talked about this in terms of like social things and things that are available to able people, but can you talk a little bit about what accessibility means beyond the ramp?
I know that when we talk about laws, people just assume like, oh, there's the ADA. They don't really know like the depth or like the actual weight of what it does. And then they just write it off and be like, well, my restaurant has a ramp, or we have a accessible toilet or a bathroom that you can use. It's the only one, but we're doing great. We're ADA compliant. But the thing about the ADA is that it is the floor. It is the bare minimum of things that people need to meet in order for things to be accessible. And the extra work that people think of outside of the ADA, that we encounter a lot when we're out and just hanging out, being people in the world, is the attitudes and the expectations of what people with disabilities can or can't do. So, for example, we go to a restaurant and there's a ramp and the door is great and there's a table and they seat us, and then the waiter only talks to you, Bree, as the able-bodied person, and they don't even acknowledge me, even though maybe I'm the one paying for dinner, or I can speak for myself, and assuming that you are my care attendant, or even things like when I'm around other disabled people, they think that we're on some field trip or something instead of just us hanging out as friends. And that's who I choose to spend my time with, and the people that I love. Or
well, and like the more than two wheelchairs means people aren't just hanging out with their friends or family. There's definitely a group field trip happening.
That's the only solution, is there's a field trip and my parents had to sign a permission slip for me to be able to go out. Like, the amount of times that people think that Kaylin and I are either sisters or that we are like not actually partners is mind blowing.
And you both happen to use wheelchairs.
Yep.
Like,
That's like the main thing in common. That's the one thing that people see. And then like in the same breath, people will be like, but I don't see the wheelchair. I'm like,
well, that's weird because I do.
I hope you do. What, I'm like, am I levitating? Like, what do you see if it's not the chair? I'm so confused. Please tell me.
Well, we talked about, we go to a lot of concerts, right? That's just something that we do, you and I do within our friend group. And when we go to concerts, if there is an ADA section, generally speaking, there's sort of an unspoken limit around how many of us can hang out with you in the ADA section. So we might go to a concert with 5 of us and one of us uses a wheelchair. And so only one of us gets to be in the wheelchair section with you. And that's something that I think able people just don't think about. Like, people who use wheelchairs have multiple friends that they do things with.
We have friends, number one.
Right.
They're not all disabled. Some of them are, but not always. And we have more than one of them. And our crew specifically, we roll pretty deep. And so when we go to a show and they're like, oh, you like, who is your one person? And I'm like, all 5 of them? Can they all stay? And they're like, well, no, they have to go to the other section.
Yeah. Let's be one giant person. We'll just lump together.
Right. We're all one crew.
It also, gosh, what was it making me think about? It was making me think about something that goes back to this ADA legislation, which is just like the bare minimum. So in terms of accessibility, like we're saying, ramps and elevators, that seems to be the solution. But if we're looking at the future of the ADA and maybe say someone like me and allies role in this, and also to tie that into the community and the movement, what are the things that able people can do, or sort of what other facets of this movement need support? Because it's like any other movement. I think we've talked about it. People need to cook food and drive people places and make signs. And, I think that those are things that people look over when we look at a movement.
Mm-hmm. I think there's lots of different roles. And one thing that I do want to say about, I know we've been emphasizing the independent living movement, and that, like, I work for an independent living center, and we wanted to make sure that people could live independent lives. And no one does anything independently. Like, we all rely on each other for something. Like, I didn't build this house. I didn't make the clothes I'm wearing. I made some of the food I ate today, but not all of it. And so if we take the disability component out of it and realize that every human needs support and needs somebody else to be able to exist in this world, and that stems from biology. Like, ants support other animals in the ecosystem, and without those, the whole ecosystem would crumble. And so within a movement, there are certain roles for allies and folks who are just down with making sure that people have equal access to things. So it could be as simple as making sure that when you're invited to a committee and they're making decisions about the community, that there's disability voice represented. And if you're at a show or at a restaurant and you take notice that, oh, this place is accessible, or the bathrooms are really wide and so a wheelchair could get in, or wow, this bar is really great, they even have a Braille menu. Just starting to notice and shift your perspective is huge, because then once you start to shift your perspective, you'll start to notice other things around you and realize that there are things bigger than yourself. At the same time, as allies and folks are shifting into this new mindset, I don't have the energy to also, like, give people cookies for doing the work that should be happening. So like, while the work is necessary and we need that support, I also like it can't be, hey, I noticed this thing and Rosemary, I want to tell you all about it because I did something good for you. I need it to not be just for me. And maybe I'm the only disabled person that you know, and that's great, but I am not the one disabled person speaker. I have one experience in this world, and I try to think of it from a lens of lots of other experiences, but just shifting to think outside of yourself, I think is really important, especially if we're dreaming up a new future for what happens beyond the ADA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me.
Okay.
Before you go, I would love for you to give a little shout out for the movie Crip Camp. If you could tell folks, I think it's available on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
Would you tell people what Crip Camp is about?
Crip Camp was released about a month and a half ago on Netflix, and it is a documentary film about the disability rights movement, and it started at this Woodstock-esque camp for disabled folks back east called Camp Jened. And a lot of these folks that went to this camp was the first time that they had realized that there was an actual community of disabled folks. And from that, they all stayed in touch and continued to do things within the disability rights movement. And a lot of them became pivotal characters in moving the Rehabilitation Act forward and moving the Americans with Disabilities Act forward. And a lot of that started with this identity within a community and knowing that you're not alone and that there are other folks out there who have similar experiences to you. And honestly, like having Crip Camp on Netflix on a huge platform like that was the first time that I've seen actual representation of disability and not just like actors who were pretending to have disabilities or one token character that gets one episode in a series. This whole thing is actual people with disabilities and their lived experience just having fun and enjoying summer camp that then turned into a whole movement. And so if you want to learn more and if you want to dive in and really see the disability humor and all the jokes that we crack at each other, I highly recommend that you watch Crip Camp.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's a great thing for folks to watch who maybe will forget sometimes that people with disabilities also have a sense of humor, and we make fun of each other in our friend groups, and we have the same kind of silly inside jokes and things that any other friend group does. And that's what that movie did for me. Thank you for speaking to it. Thank you so much for being on the show and for talking to me about the ADA and accessibility and the disability movement and rights at large. Thanks, Rosemary.
You're welcome. Bye.